Omuuonge Uozombuze.
Amaba hoasa.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Teresa. We have heard about COVID-19 before. That's the overall topic 2020. The global pandemic has seen global news consumption rise, as we learned this morning for the e-paper. Like I noted down 1,000%. Wow, that's a lot. Audiences for print, radio, television are up, and people are spending more time on news websites seeking reliable information about the virus and the social and economic consequences of our policy responses. This makes trust in the media more imperative than ever. And that is why Gwen Lister, the chairperson of the Namibia Media Trust, co-organiser of this conference, and you've actually met her this morning, is joined by Frederico Links, research associate with the Institute for Public Policy Research in Namibia and editor of Namibia Fact Check, as well as Dr. Basil Hamusokwe, lecturer, researcher, media consultant, and head of the Department of Media and Communication Studies at the University of Zambia. Frederico's research interest includes corruption, democracy and elections, party, political finance, empowerment policies, internet governance, and public procurement. And Basil has worked as a journalist and is head of the department. He's the general manager of the University of Zambia Radio. He's also a board member in charge of programs at the Media Network on Children's Rights and Development. His research interests include media policy, thus media freedom, media sustainability, health communication, children's rights and development, and media freedom. He has been involved in both the development and evaluation of communication strategies for different institutions. And in the next minutes, Basil will start the session with a presentation of the baseline study that he spearheaded for MISA Zambia on trust in the news media, spanning 3 countries, that is Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. The purpose of the survey was to generate evidence through research on the state of trust in the media. Gwen, Basil, and Frederico, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Marcus, and good afternoon, colleagues. So, as rightly introduced, this is Basil, and this research was actually commissioned by DW Academy. The objective of the study has already been given to explore what it means to trust or not to trust the media, and it was across 3 countries, that is Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi. So, you know, it was an interesting study, which was mostly based on, if you remember, or if you're familiar with what is known as the Roper question. You know, the Roper question was used in order to explore trust in the media in Southern Africa. So the question says, where do you get most of your news about what's going on in the world today? Is it from newspapers, radio, television, magazines, or talking to other people, or where? And so to bring this question up to date, the research also added the internet. So the methodology of this study was therefore based on the Roper question in order to spread across the different types of media. So generally, we looked at magazines, newspapers, TV, radio, and the social media. The social media in terms of social media news platforms, and also, you know, social media by general users. It was both qualitative and quantitative. So from the quantitative findings, the summary is that from the 3 countries, we found that 23% in Zimbabwe, 23% of the people in Zimbabwe, that is Harare, trusted the social media. And then 22% trusted radio. And then this was followed by print newspapers, then television, which had 11%, and the like. Then when we came to Malawi, the highest was radio, 68% trusted radio as a source of news. And then this was followed by a 9% in social media general user, 8% in the social media news platforms, and 8% and 3% in print newspapers and the like. In Zambia, again, the highest was radio, which amounted to 45% trust, and this was followed by television, and which was 31%, and then news, social media platforms, which was accounted for 9%. So you can see the trends that in Zimbabwe, especially, I think there's less trust in the traditional media, so to say, and people are moving towards the social media. So people seem to trust the social media more in Zimbabwe, and they're establishing these alternative news sources, which are countering the news from the traditional media sources, which are mostly controlled by the government. Then in Malawi, there's been a proliferation of radio stations. So many people tend to trust radio more than any other channel. And also because the internet penetration in Malawi seems not to have, gone deep into many rural areas, or not so many people actually are accessing news through social media. Whereas in Zambia, radio seems to be the most prominent source. Now, this is mostly analyzed through, of course, it was quantitative and qualitative. In analyzing these findings, we also tried to conceptualize what trust is. And I'm sure as we are going to keep talking about or discussing this concept, the definition of trust has been very, very contested and fluid. There's no agreed definition of what actually constitutes trust. But the general understanding that we relied upon is that it is the conscious placing of faith or belief in the credibility of the news and the decision to trust or not to trust. So it is people putting faith in a specific news source. And this is what we generally used to determine what trust. Of course, other scholars would contest this concept and say, look, trust is not the same as credibility. And yes, but we try to spread this understanding of trust and credibility and reputation and all those things across to just gauge views of people's inclinations towards which news channels and the like. So from Zimbabwe, again, what we also found problematic, which cuts across many countries, is the polarization of the media, in the sense that media institutions mostly do report based on their ideological stance. So you find that there are news organizations which were established to support certain ideological movements, and others, to support different ideological movements. And this is classified across the political divide in terms of the ruling party and the opposition party. So you find that there's type of media that will be in support of the ruling party and some that are just supporting the opposition party. And this goes to the extent where journalists would go to the same event and come out with different stories. The same event, the journalist who's coming maybe from a state-controlled and owned media organization will write a completely different story from the one that is coming from a privately owned news organization. And so journalists have been indoctrinated, and this has been socialized through these newsrooms and the DNAs of journalists to support to write according to these ideologies. And this is not peculiar to Zimbabwe. It cuts across even to Zambia, where even here the kind of reporting is actually determined by these positions, ideological positions, and it also, to some extent, also extends to Malawi. So basically, that's what this study found. There are many other findings that that were established. Then we also made recommendations in the sense that we thought that the journalists, first of all, needed to be trained in order to write professionally in terms of how to avoid these ideological challenges, financial challenges, and other factors that influence their reporting. They need to be trained in terms of how to check facts, that are coming from sources as they interact with the various sources. One other thing was that there's need for the media, to advocate, because most of these journalists are drawn into these ideological positions because of the powers of the state, the political powers that, that overwhelm them. So it appears that they are left with no choice but to draw these lines. And so we thought that there should be advocacy, in terms of trying to repeal certain laws, that are against the practice of journalism, so that journalists are left free to also operate independently. The other issue also that was established was that, of course, that is drawn from the morning discussion about sustainability. If the media are able to sustain themselves, then the dependence on other institutions and financial or political factors may not influence their reporting. But also, most importantly, we thought that there's need for advocacy in terms of media literacy. The public needs to be taught how to understand the news. Many people still get the news, whatever they get from the news, as gospel truth, whether it is from a privately owned media or a government media. Whatever they get, they just receive it like a sponge, and this affects mostly people from rural areas. So there's need for media, for media literacy education, so that the public, individuals, can be able to analyze the news on their own, be able to separate fact from fiction. What came out also most prominently is the effect of the social media. The effect of the social media on news, on journalism in all the countries. It was established that most of the news on social media is fake. And it was also established that to a certain extent, journalists on social media just report what has been reported through the traditional or in the traditional media. When they sit to write their own story, mostly it is without any sources, it is without any context, and they just write from their heads to just take sides and perhaps speculate about what's happening in society. So there is need from that perspective to be able to train the public, for them to be able to analyze the news, to be able to understand that this news source is not objective, or it's not fair, or it's not balanced, because the source is, the writer is just relying on one source and not the other source, and the like. The last recommendation I would like to make is to encourage transparency in media practice. Media should be made accountable. Journalists, that is reporters and editors, should be made accountable to the information they publish to some extent, that they should be able to explain the decisions or the motivations for publishing certain news. if the public are told about what was going on, for example, behind the scenes, the potential areas of conflict that the newsroom had, and the sources, the options in the sources that they had in order to publish, to write a certain piece or story, then the public would understand and actually, be more benevolent, to the news reporting process, understand the media, and perhaps even build more trust in what the media is publishing. So I think that's my 10 minutes. Thank you very much, Marcus. Maybe Frederick can pick it up.
Thanks, Doctor. I'm going to just chip in here, if I may.
Okay.
Just to say thank you very much for a great presentation. If I may, because what it struck me when you were speaking is when we talk about trust, and you said there are various definitions, it's not so easy to define what exactly is trust. But it seems to me, I'm wondering if people who are polled aren't necessarily confusing the issues of trust and like. And I don't know whether you'd like to speak to that, because I'm struck also by the fact that it is primarily radio in the 3 countries which you've worked in that is seen as the most trusted medium. It differs a little bit with Namibia, where I think print is generally speaking the most trusted. We haven't done a survey as you have, but when the youth are polled, they generally say it's print that is most trusted. And so I'm wondering, what do you think? Do people maybe confuse trust and like when they answer that question?
Well, there were different layers of the question. Of course, there was a question which was trying to establish the levels of, the source is not exactly the most trusted source. The most prominent source may not exactly be the most trusted source. For example, in Zambia, it was established that many people are on social media, and they interact with the social media news on the phones and all that, right? But for the news, they still have to wait for radio or television to actually, listen to the news or see the news on TV. And then that's the way they would confirm what they've been reading throughout the day, perhaps on social media. So some responded would indicate that I would read the news on social media, but I would not make a decision to say this is the correct interpretation of events. I would have to wait for news time, maybe on radio or TV, to get some sort of confirmation. And then that's when I'll confirm, say, oh, this is the news I read, and therefore it could be true. So we try to distinguish between those 2 levels.
Right. I also find myself sort of thinking mentally, and maybe when we open this up for discussion, others have some views on this. And the question is, in terms of the preferences in the different countries in Southern Africa for radio, print, TV, or social media, whatever it may be, what is the correlation between those preferences on the one hand and an informed population on the other? That might be a very fascinating study to take on at some point. But Doctor, if I may, can I put you on the spot? And
yes, please.
Are we still, and just ask you, if you ask the question as to 3 things that the media could do to engender more trust on the part of people or the public, what 3 things would you name?
In order to improve trust?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, it is transparency. One, the media need to be accountable. So yeah, if they are more transparent in terms of the way they make their decisions, then I think the public would trust them more. And the other thing is that I think there's need for media literacy. People need to understand how to understand the media.
Right.
Maybe I'll give you those 2 things.
Okay, good. And maybe more ideas come up during the discussion. I think it's also true to say that this discussion we're having now about trust, which obviously leads to upskilling journalists, is a very important one, and it presupposes that there is an enabling environment in which journalism can flourish. So I think it's important just to put that there. It's not the topic of our discussion today, but obviously the more press freedom, probably the better the quality of journalism. The Namibia Media Trust has also recently done basically a training needs assessment in Namibia itself. And it was interesting, some of the things that came out of that, and one of which was, of course, the need for journalism basics. It was interesting that it was both management and young journalists who rated this probably as the number one thing that needs to be done in terms of training, namely to look at research, interviewing techniques, investigative reporting, ethics, and they ranked the need for basic journalism training way above the need for digital skills. So that's interesting as we go forward into this discussion and we look at the issue of trust as opposed to quality journalism. I think also there are a couple of sort of, what can I call it, controversial things I want to put into the discussion. But I think first of all, I'm going to turn to Frederico Links. Frederico, as you all know, is with Namibia Fact Check. And for Frederico, one of the most fundamentally important things is media literacy and, of course, verification skills. And he and I have had many interesting discussions around the fact checkers. And I've often said it's journalists who should be the fact checkers. And it seems in recent times, because journalists aren't necessarily always fact checking, that they are in fact fact checking institutions jumping up all over the place to help journalists in this task. So maybe Frederico, can you share with us just for a few minutes some of your thoughts around the importance of verification, fact checking in the context of improving journalism, getting back to basics, and ultimately winning back the public trust, one hopes.
Thanks, Gwen. Can you hear me? Is the sound fine?
Yep.
Yes, it is.
Right. Okay, thanks. Yes, I mean, very much the emergence of fact checkers, not just in this part of the world, but as a whole, around the world, has been a consequence of poor journalistic practice, and just flat out bad journalism. And I mean, over the last few years, the numbers of fact checkers across the continent, and just this year, I mean, a number of fact checkers have emerged, and since last year, I think the fact checkers on the continent have actually doubled, if not tripled, and that's the same trend in other parts of the world as well. And this is a consequence of what's happening sort of in mainstream journalism, where, I mean, a lot of the stuff that we're doing as Namibia Fact Check is also monitoring the quality of reporting of your traditional media outlets, which on the whole has become problematic in terms of how issues are framed and presented. And that is part of the reason why we decided to establish a fact checker within the Institute for Public Policy Research stable. Now, my background is, of course, journalism. So I have an interest in making sure that, as Basil also indicated, that journalists are held accountable, because this impacts me as well. And what I'm doing is journalism. This is basically the basics of journalism, fact checking. And this is what a lot of newsrooms and a lot of journalists have sort of strayed from. Is this basic tenet of journalism, checking the facts, making sure that is what is being communicated. And I mean, COVID-19 has, I think, sort of underscored the problems that we have, sort of seen build up around journalism, not just here in Namibia, but also, in the region, as Basil pointed out, where, in July, I published a paper, an observational paper on the sort of things that we are seeing around COVID-19 and the reporting of COVID-19 within the media space and on social media and the communication from various authorities, government authorities. And it was very clear that, the falsehoods, the disinformation, the misinformation were coming from senior government officials, health authorities, private citizens, and prominent media practitioners. And I hesitate to call some of these people journalists, but I mean, they operate in the journalistic space, but they were also spreaders of COVID-19 related disinformation and all sorts of falsehoods. And these were one of the observations that we made that emerged from what we were monitoring. And I just want to sort of point to some others as well. So Namibian news media organizations and news reporters have been substantially and conspicuously absent from efforts to debunk or fact check COVID-19 related lies, myths, hoaxes, and conspiracy theories. And instead, some have been prominently part of the disinformation problem. The substantial evidence of Namibian news media in debunking and fact-checking COVID-19 related disinformation has spotlighted coverage weaknesses and shortfalls and exposed a news media not attuned or responsive to whether and how public discussion is taking place and shifting. Now, this is a big issue because about 27%, according to Afrobarometer, the latest Afrobarometer, the results of which came out earlier this year, about 27% of Namibians get their news through social media. So that's their primary source of news. Whereas only 23% actually get their news through traditional media platforms, such as newspapers, only 23%. So more get their news through social media than through, for instance, newspapers. And of course, radio is the predominant channel through which people get their news and information. But if you consider that, where a lot of people were having trouble discerning what is true and what is false on social media platforms and on messaging apps such as WhatsApp. And the media wasn't in this space to help them wade through this.
Navigate,
to wade through this, the sort of cesspool of disinformation that social media and especially Facebook had become over the first 6 months of this year. And the traditional media was substantially absent from helping people navigate through this space. And especially, going back to that figure where more people get their news via social media than traditional media, which in this case refers mostly, I think, to the newspapers. There was this very glaring gap in where traditional media could have really done a lot in terms of engendering trust and didn't go into that space and help people with this, which is opposite to what was happening in other media markets, for instance, in the US and Europe, where traditional media outlets very quickly set up COVID-19 fact-checking units within their newsrooms. Whereas in this part of the world, it seems that newsrooms were not responding to that space. So that is a big issue, and it sort of speaks to a sort of silo mentality within the newsroom and a silo engagement and a disjointed engagement with the public. So what this points to is that Namibian news media generally do not appear to fully grasp or appropriately appreciate the potential public health consequences or the potentially disastrous trust-related impacts on the media sector itself of the occurrence of pervasive health-related disinformation. So the media, from what we were observing, did not seem to grasp that COVID-19 manifested as an existential and a trust threat to the media here in Namibia. And I don't think that is fully grasped yet at this point in 2020. So we did make some recommendations around this, and basically, you know, media organizations have to be more responsive in times of crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic presented, which was whereas as opposed to sticking to this one-way reporting of the health authorities said this on a daily basis, and that was what was reported. Instead of engaging with where people actually were in terms of the information they were engaging with and that they were encountering, a lot of which, of course, was falsehoods and disinformation. So I'm going to leave it there, and then we can delve further into issues as you go along.
Okay, because Frederico, it strikes me as you're speaking that you're quite critical of the role of journalists. I have seen studies, I don't know, not necessarily African studies, but that in fact, public trust in the media has increased over this COVID period, but that's probably not for our discussion right now, whether that is global or just in certain places. The other thing is that I think we really do need to keep in mind, you know, back in the day, a reporter was a reporter, a photographer was a photographer, and you had very specific role in the media, which was then mainly traditional media. Nowadays, and I raise this in the question of training and getting back to basics, we are expecting our reporters to know the basics of good journalism. We're expecting them to come back having done their story, upload a video, talk to their audience, create a podcast, because in the fight for sustainability, obviously traditional media are looking at broadening their scope in the media field, and reporters are just more and more is being put on their shoulders. So if we go back to the issue of basic journalistic skills and also the need for digital skills in this new era, where do we need to put the focus? As I say, in Namibia, people still feel the basic skills are in terms of journalism, how to write a good story, good interviewing techniques, research, how to develop sources, the real basics. And maybe I should add into basics the point that, do we need to put into this discussion the issue of the characteristics of a good journalist? And perhaps that speaks to your somewhat critical view of journalism today. More and more young people going into media because they just need a job, not because they really have passion for the craft or because they really believe that journalism is a public service. So there are a number of issues around this that maybe we can unpack a little bit. Maybe if Basil would like to speak briefly to that, and how and if this sort of thinking had any resonance in his study of the three countries.
Thank you, Gwen. Yeah, it did. You see, I think now this hinges on the definition of journalism itself. So right. So there are certain actors that are suggesting that it's now beyond journalists, because everyone can now disseminate information. So right. There's journalism now being looked at from the peripheral actors as well. You see, and most of the time those actors do not understand the basics. You see, right. So and so there's this pull from the peripheries, but also there's this hold on. You know, there's this hold on the principles by those that feel they are trained and that are observing that maybe other people are infiltrating their profession, you know, and they are the ones that are causing all this. But for me, really, from my experience in this study, what I also noticed is that it is the deliberate socialization of journalists. The issues of fact-checking may be known, the competencies may be there, but the political socialization, you know, the ideologies. So there's this deliberate, you know, inclination to, for example, pick one source you know, depending on where you want to direct the story to, and ignore the other source.
Right.
And that's why I keep making the point of accountability and transparency. You see, so if a journalist or an editor could be made accountable to explain why, you know, their choices, their decisions in the newsroom, why did they pick one source over the other? You know, because obviously the choice of sources will slant the stories one direction and not the other. You know, and that doesn't mean that they do not know the principles. In most cases, they do know the principles. In most cases, they even know how to do the fact checking, but it is the ideological socialization, you know, in the newsrooms. And that's why a part of my recommendations was advocacy to free journalists from political entanglements, from these ideological entanglements. You know, and that's why perhaps the morning session about sustainability of the practice is very important. You know, it will make journalists even more independent, such that they will not be influenced by these financial and political factors anymore.
Right, and I think it's also important to say that trust cannot happen without understanding. And I think you raise it in your study, and Frederico also referred to it indirectly, that there needs to be an understanding on the part of readers, viewers, and listeners as to what the media is about. Because again, I think if someone listens to the radio and there's a DJ on, they think that's a journalist. So we need to perhaps, as media, as journalists, do more to develop public understanding, and also in so doing, in terms of what Federico has said, to guide them to the right or the best sources of information. So the two definitely go hand in hand, trust and, as I say, really working on the basics for real journalists, whether they are writing for print media, whether they're working for radio or online, that the same skills need apply, and that we mustn't perhaps distract too much with making them learn skills which are really extraneous to the task of good journalism. I don't know if this is the appropriate time, Marcus, to hand back to you and to get some questions. I lost track of time because we started a bit late, but maybe there are questions for our guest today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Gwen. Thanks, Basil. Thanks, Federico. I guess Gregory had a question. Is that right? Then I'll just hand over to you.
Okay, I was just interested with what Basil was talking about. In the studies that they have, I wanted to know if at all they also looked at issues of framing, because with the coming in of social media, we no longer decide what is news. And apparently, the traditional media has also suffered the same situations where you no longer decide what is news, whereby if the corporates are the ones that are giving out money for the kind of adverts that we get in the news for running the newspapers or the broadcasting stations that we have, as well as even the political influence, you find that they are the people that are going to decide how we are going to frame the news. So in the study that they have, I just wanted to find out how that was also considered.
Should I get in, Gwen?
Yes, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, thank you, Gregory. Of course, we did not really go into the detail of establishing the framing aspect of news, but it came out again in the sense that we tried to establish the levels of trust between the public media and the private media, and again, the divide was the same in the sense that people trusted the public media more, the private media more than the public media, for obvious reasons, that the public media are obviously the voice of the authorities and the government of the day and the like. So in line with that, it appears that journalists working in the public media, frame the news to suit the agendas of the public authorities, whereas the journalists in private media, kind of frame the news to be critical to the government of the day. So that was the difference, and that's how far we could go. We didn't really, delve so much to establish the factors that influenced journalists in terms of how the news is framed and the like.
Thank you very much, Basil.
Any more questions, Marcus?
That's the question I do have. Are there more questions? I've seen that parts of the studies are already moved around on WhatsApp and in the Zoom call. Any more questions from the audience, ladies and gentlemen? Okay, Basil? Yeah.
So I can. Yeah. So the interesting question in this session of trust in the media, I'll leave the colleagues with is, with all these entanglements in the media and the current state of the media in Southern Africa, who or what would you trust between the government and the media? I think that's the question now which people are really struggling with. Because of the alliances that the media have made with certain individuals, corporations, and the government itself, and the governments themselves. So there's a question now in terms of what can be trusted more between the media and the government, and this is where the level of practice has now come.
Can I respond to that?
Absolutely.
Yes, Frederico.
I mean, if you, just trying to answer your question, looking at the Afrobarometer of 2019, which was released earlier this year, the Afrobarometer found that journalists were less trusted even than politicians, and journalists were social media users were blamed firstly for spreading false news. Secondly, journalists. 62% of respondents said journalists, and just shaving politicians 60%. Now Gwen said, and this is, I'm aware of the studies that say there's been an increase in trust in media through this pandemic, but these studies weren't done in our part of the world. Just South Africa was included in the Oxford Reuters study. So it would be interesting to see how these figures look just a year on from Afrobarometer, if actually the trust levels in traditional media have risen. Now, I say that's interesting because I think a lot of effort in the northern parts of the world, in Europe and America, media organizations responded very quickly to COVID-19, as I indicated, and put in place all sorts of newsroom innovations that dealt with the COVID-19 situation, and that are still ongoing. And they went into partnerships with all sorts of complementary organizations, such as fact checkers, such as the major social media platforms. Now, these sort of innovations you did not see, certainly not on the Namibian media landscape, and you certainly did. I don't think you largely saw them, aside from a few countries on the continent. You saw these sorts of innovations, but what you did see was the emergence of a lot more fact checkers on the continent, which suggests, I think, in a way that maybe the rising trust levels in other parts of the world, the global north, for instance, would not necessarily be reflected in our parts of the world. But we can only establish that through proper research. But I think when it comes to looking at the trust that in our media here, and we have to be critical. I don't think at this point we can afford not to be highly critical of the media in our part of the world. I don't think that is a response we can adopt. We should be very critical because media audiences are, especially young audiences, are going to move away from traditional media, and there's going to be a void where they're going to be searching for information and not finding it, and not even going to engage with traditional media. And I see a lot of that already. And there are some studies that are pointing to that being the case. So we have to get traditional media, we have to get the practice of journalism back on track, where the need for fact checkers actually disappears. But projections are that the numbers of fact checkers on the continent will just grow because of the quality of the journalistic practice across this continent. So, I mean, the situation will probably get worse before it gets better. Unfortunately, surface level, and this is one of the issues I have, is sort of surface level training of journalists are not going to bridge what is busy happening, and there will have to be engagements at curriculum level at tertiary institutions, within media organizations, within various other types of training organizations, and maybe even within the school, the school curriculum, where we have media and information literacy and digital literacy incorporated as subjects to make our media markets more sophisticated, and to help our journalists be better trained coming out of school, to be able to go into sort of quality training programs at tertiary levels. So it's not just the one thing that will change things. It'll have to be a lot of other changes in a lot of other spheres outside of the media landscape, where I think changes will bear the most fruit. But that's a long-term engagement, I fear.
Can I chip in there, Marcus, quickly?
Yeah, quickly, please.
Thank you. And just to say that, we talk about, and I think we all presuppose that getting back to the basics and getting it right, as Frederico said, will bring back public trust. That's the question. Will it really? We can't ignore something like what is happening in the US, where 70 million people voted for Donald Trump. The facts don't matter. The truth doesn't matter. And I'm wondering to what extent we need to look at our various, it may differ from country to country in Southern Africa and further afield on the continent, but what do people want? Do they want the facts? Do they want the truth? Do they want good journalism? Do they realize the impact that it will have in making a difference in their lives and in improving democracy? I think this is the critical question. We know what we need to do, but is there the appetite out there for that change?
Thank you very much, Gwen, sorry.
Yep.
I need a break, obviously, and that's what's next on the list. First of all, I would like to thank all three of you. We tackled one of the core questions, whom to trust. We talked about one of the crucial aspects, and you mentioned the US president, and maybe I have a song for you for this screen break. Now it's called Back to Life, and it obviously starts in January 2021. Okay, getting back to life. We see each other back in 10 minutes. And once again, thanks to all of you that were interesting insights. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Omuuonge Uozombuze.
Amaba.